Libertarianism is a political philosophy that upholds liberty as its principal objective. Libertarians seek to maximize autonomy and freedom of choice, emphasizing political freedom, voluntary association, and the primacy of individual judgment. Libertarians generally share a skepticism of authority. However, they diverge on the scope of their opposition to existing political and economic systems. Various schools of libertarian thought offer a range of views regarding the legitimate functions of state and private power, often calling to restrict or even to wholly dissolve coercive social institutions, rather than embodying a singular, rigid systematic theory or ideology. Libertarianism has been applied as an umbrella term to a wide range of sometimes discordant political ideas through modern history. Some libertarians advocate laissez-faire capitalism and strong private property rights, such as in land, infrastructure, and natural resources. Others, notably libertarian socialists, seek to abolish capitalism and private ownership of the means of production in favor of their common or cooperative ownership and management. An additional line of division is between monarchists and anarchists. While monarchists think that a minimal centralized government is necessary, anarchists propose to completely eliminate the state. The term libertarianism originally referred to a philosophical belief in free will but later became associated with anti-state socialism. Enlightenment-influenced political movements critical of institutional authority believed to serve forms of social domination and injustice. While it has generally retained its earlier political usage as a synonym for either social or individualist anarchism through much of the world, in the United States it has since come to describe pro-capitalist economic liberalism more so than radical, anti-capitalist egalitarianism. In the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, libertarianism is defined as the moral view that agents initially fully own themselves and have certain moral powers to acquire property rights in external things. As individualist opponents of social liberalism embraced the label and distanced themselves from the word liberal, American writers, political parties, and think tanks adopted the word libertarian to describe advocacy of capitalist free market economics and a night watchman state. Etymology. The term libertarian was first used by late Enlightenment freethinkers to refer to the metaphysical belief in free will, as opposed to determinism. The first recorded use was in 1789, when William Belsham wrote about libertarianism in opposition to necessitarian, i.e., determinist, views. Libertarian came to mean an advocate or defender of liberty, especially in the political and social spheres, as early as 1796, when the London Packet printed on the 12th of February. Lately marched out of the prison at Bristol, 450 of the French libertarians. The word was again used in a political sense in 1802, in a short piece critiquing a poem by the author of Geber, and has since been used with this meaning. The use of the word libertarian to describe a new set of political positions has been traced to the French cognate, libertaire, coined in a scathing letter French libertarian communist Joseph Déjacque wrote to mutualist Pierre-Joseph Proudhon in 1857, castigating him for his sexist political views. Déjacque also used the term for his anarchist publication Le Libertaire, Journal du Mouvement Social, which was printed from the 9th of June 1858 to the 4th of February 1861 in New York City. In the mid-1890s, Sébastien Fauré began publishing a new Le Libertaire while France's Third Republic enacted the lowest scalar rates, which banned anarchist publications in France. Libertarianism has frequently been used as a synonym for anarchism since this time, although the word libertarian continues to be widely used to refer to socialists internationally. Its meaning in the United States has deviated from its political origins. Libertarianism in the United States has been described as conservative on economic issues and liberal on personal freedom. It is also often associated with a foreign policy of non-interventionism. Since the resurgence of neoliberalism in the 1970s, free market capitalist libertarianism has spread beyond North America via think tanks and political parties. Philosophy. There is contention about whether right, left, and socialist libertarianism represent distinct ideologies as opposed to variations on a theme. All libertarians begin with a conception of personal autonomy from which they argue in favor of civil liberties and a reduction or elimination of the state. Right libertarianism developed in the United States in the mid-20th century and is the most popular conception of libertarianism in that region. It is commonly referred to as a continuation or radicalization of classical liberalism. Right libertarians value self-ownership and the non-aggression principle, which leads to strong support of private property and free market capitalism, while rejecting most or all state functions. Anarcho-capitalists believe the state inherently violates the non-aggression principle, while monarchists defend night watchman states on the grounds that certain government functions are required to protect individual rights. They defend wage labor in concentrations of wealth so long as they are voluntary. Left libertarianism encompasses those libertarian beliefs that claim the Earth's natural resources belong to everyone in some egalitarian manner, either unowned or owned collectively. Contemporary left libertarians such as Hillel Steiner, Peter Valentine, Philippe Van Paris, Michael Otsuka, and David Ellerman believe the appropriation of land must leave enough and as good for others or be taxed by society to compensate for the exclusionary effects of private property. Libertarian socialists promote usufruct and socialist economic theories, including communism, collectivism, syndicalism, and mutualism. They criticize the state for being the defender of private property and believe capitalism entails wage slavery. Personal autonomy. Anarchism envisages freedom as a form of autonomy, which Paul Goodman describes as the ability to initiate a task and do it one's own way, without orders from authorities who do not know the actual problem and the available means. All anarchists oppose political and legal authority, but collectivist strains also oppose the economic authority of private property. These social anarchists emphasize mutual aid, whereas individualist anarchists extol individual sovereignty. The non-aggression principle is the foundation of most present-day right libertarian philosophies. It is a moral stance which asserts that aggression is inherently illegitimate. The NAP and property rights are closely linked, since what constitutes aggression depends on what rights a person has. Aggression, for the purposes of the NAP, is defined as the initiation or threat of violence against a person or his legitimately owned property. Specifically, any unsolicited action that physically affects another individual's property or person, no matter if the result of those actions is damaging, beneficial, or neutral to the owner, are considered violent or aggressive when they are against the owner's will and interfere with his right to self-ownership and self-determination. Supporters of the NAP often appeal to it in order to argue for the immorality of theft, vandalism, assault, and fraud. In contrast to non-violence, the non-aggression principle does not preclude violence used in self-defense or the defense of others. Civil liberties. Libertarian socialists have been strong advocates and activists of civil liberties, including free love and free thought. Advocates of free love viewed sexual freedom as a clear, direct expression of individual sovereignty, and sometimes traced their roots back to the early anarchist Josiah Warren and experimental communities. They particularly stressed women's rights, as most sexual laws discriminated against women, for example, marriage laws and anti-birth control measures. Free love appeared alongside Annika Feminism and advocacy of LGBT rights. Annika Feminism developed as a synthesis of radical feminism and anarchism, and views patriarchy as a fundamental manifestation of compulsory government. It was inspired by the late 19th century writings of early feminist anarchists such as Lucy Parsons, Emma Goldman, Voltaire de Cleyre and Virginia Bolton. Annika feminists, like other radical feminists, criticize and advocate the abolition of traditional conceptions of family, education and gender roles. Free Society was a major anarchist newspaper in the United States that staunchly advocated free love and women's rights, while criticizing comstockery, the censorship of sexual information. In recent times, anarchism has also voiced opinions and taken action around certain sex-related subjects such as pornography, BDSM, and the sex industry. Free thought is a philosophical viewpoint that holds opinions should be formed on the basis of science, logic, and reason, in contrast with authority, tradition, or other dogmas. In the United States, free thought was a basically anti-Christian, anti-clerical movement, whose purpose was to make the individual politically and spiritually free to decide for himself on religious matters. A number of contributors to Liberty were prominent figures in both free thought and anarchism. The individualist anarchist George MacDonald was a co-editor of Free Thought and, for a time, The Truth Seeker. E.C. Walker was co-editor of the Free Thought, Free Love journal Lucifer, the Light-Bearer. In 1901, Catalan anarchist and freethinker Francesc Ferrer i Guàrdia established modern, or progressive schools in Barcelona in defiance of an educational system controlled by the Catholic Church. Fiercely anti-clerical, Ferrer believed in freedom in education, i.e., education free from the authority of the church and state. The school's stated goal was to educate the working class in a rational, secular and non-coercive setting. Later in the 20th century, Austrian Freudian Marxist Wilhelm Reich became a consistent propagandist for sexual freedom, going as far as opening free sex counseling clinics in Vienna for working-class patients, as well as coining the phrase "sexual revolution" in one of his books from the 1940s. During the early 1970s, the English anarchist and pacifist Alex Comfort achieved international celebrity for writing the sex manuals The Joy of Sex, and More Joy of Sex. State most libertarians are anarchists and believe the state inherently violates personal autonomy. As Robert Paul Wolff has argued, since the state is authority, the right to rule, anarchism which rejects the state is the only political doctrine consistent with autonomy in which the individual alone is the judge of his moral constraints. Social anarchists believe the state offends private property, which they view as intrinsically harmful, while market-oriented libertarians argue that so-called free markets actually consist of economic privileges granted by the state. These latter libertarians advocate instead for freed markets, which are freed from these privileges. There is a debate amongst right libertarians as to whether or not the state is legitimate. While anarcho-capitalists advocate its abolition, monarchists support minimal states, often referred to as night watchman states. Libertarians take a skeptical view of government authority. Monarchists maintain that the state is necessary for the protection of individuals from aggression, theft, breach of contract, and fraud. They believe the only legitimate governmental institutions are the military, police, and courts, though some expand this list to include fire departments, prisons, and the executive and legislative branches. They justify the state on the grounds that it is the logical consequence of adhering to the non-aggression principle and argue that anarchism is amoral because it implies that the non-aggression principle is optional, that the enforcement of laws under anarchism is open to competition. Another common justification is that private defense agencies and court firms would tend to represent the interests of those who pay them enough. Anarcho-capitalists argue that the state violates the non-aggression principle by its nature because governments use force against those who have not stolen or vandalized private property, assaulted anyone, or committed fraud. Many also argue that monopolies tend to be corrupt and inefficient. that private defense and court agencies would have to have a good reputation in order to stay in business. Linda and Morris Tanhill argue that no coercive monopoly of force can arise on a truly free market, and that of government's citizenry can't desert them in favor of a competent protection and defense agency. Property rights. Right libertarians maintain that unowned natural resources may be appropriated by the first person who discovers them, mixes his labor with them, or merely claims them, without the consent of others, and with little or no payment to them. They believe that natural resources are originally unknown, and therefore, private parties may appropriate them at will without the consent of, or owing to, others. Right libertarians argue that self-ownership permits the unequal appropriation of natural resources, and are not opposed to concentrations of economic power, provided they arise through non-coercive means. Left libertarians believe that neither claiming nor mixing one's labor with natural resources is enough to generate full private property rights, and maintain that natural resources ought to be held in some egalitarian manner, either unowned or owned collectively. Left libertarianism often includes libertarians, socialists who reject private property in favor of usufruct, the mutual enjoyment of natural resources. But other left libertarians support private property under the condition that recompense is offered to the local community. Economics. Libertarians are divided on economic issues. Right libertarians are economic liberals of either the Austrian school or Chicago school and support laissez-faire capitalism, while most left libertarians argue in favor of socialist theories such as communism, syndicalism, and mutualism. Daniel Guerin writes that anarchism is really a synonym for socialism. The anarchist is primarily a socialist whose aim is to abolish the exploitation of man by man. Anarchism is only one of the streams of socialist thought. That stream whose main components are concern for liberty and haste to abolish the state. Other anarchists, including Nicolas Sacco, Bartolomeo Vanzetti, and Haymarket affair suspect Adolf Fischer, make the same point. Every anarchist is a socialist. But every socialist is not necessarily an anarchist. While social anarchists generally support communism and syndicalism, individualist anarchists emphasize mutualism. Wage labor. Wage labor has long been compared by socialists and anarcho-syndicalists to slavery. As a result, the term wage slavery is often utilized as a pejorative for wage labor. Advocates of slavery looked upon the comparative evils of slave society and of free society, of slavery to human masters and slavery to capital, and proceeded to argue persuasively that wage slavery was actually worse than chattel slavery. Slavery apologists like George Fitzhugh contended that workers only accepted wage labor with the passage of time, as they became familiarized and inattentive to the infected social atmosphere they continually inhale. According to Noam Chomsky, analysis of the psychological implications of wage slavery goes back to the Enlightenment era. In his 1791 book On the Limits of State Action, classical liberal thinker Wilhelm von Humboldt explained how whatever does not spring from a man's free choice, or is only the result of instruction and guidance, does not enter into his very nature. He does not perform it with truly human energies, but merely with mechanical exactness, and so when the laborer works under external control, we may admire what he does, but we despise what he is. For Marxists, labor as commodity, which is how they regard wage labor, provides an absolutely fundamental point of attack against capitalism. It can be persuasively argued, noted philosopher John Nelson, that the conception of the workers' labor as a commodity confirms Marx's stigmatization of the wage system of private capitalism as wage slavery, that is, as an instrument of the capitalists for reducing the worker's condition to that of a slave, if not below it. That this objection is fundamental follows immediately from Marx's conclusion that wage labor is the very foundation of capitalism.